Listen, I love seeing the comments that be like, oh man, these conspiracy theories ain't true. Ain't none of this stuff true. They got you. They got you right where they want you. Stay over there away from me, man. Nah, we unplugged out the matrix. All right? So listen, this is another video of conspiracy theories that turned out to be true.
Missing Japanese citizens. One night in June 1978, a 22-year-old single mother of 2 kids named Yaiko Taguchi was working her usual shift in Tokyo, Japan's cabaret Hollywood. After finishing her shift right at around midnight, Yaiko left the cabaret through the front door and was never seen again. At first, nobody thought that anything serious had happened to Yaiko. In fact, several years later her manager was questioned, and he claims that everyone thought she had quit when she failed to show up. At around that time, there had been rumors going around that several North Korean spies were working undercover in Japan looking to abduct innocent citizens and hold them as hostages back in North Korea. However, this was seen by the Japanese government as nothing more than a conspiracy theory that couldn't possibly be true. Sadly, the missing case of Yaiko went cold, and it wasn't until almost a decade later that a clue to her whereabouts emerged following a disturbing chain of events. In November 1987, as South Korea was preparing to host the Olympics in the capital city of Seoul, a Korean Airlines plane blew up in mid-air as it was flying over the Andaman Sea, taking the lives of 115 innocent people. During the investigation, it was revealed that 2 North Korean agents acting under direct orders from the North Korean government had planted a bomb in an overhead storage compartment before getting off at the first layover in Abu Dhabi. As the authorities were closing in on the 2 suspects, one of them took his life with a cyanide-laced cigarette, but the South Korean government was able to arrest the other agent responsible for the attack. During her interrogation, it was revealed that she had been training for that mission for 6 years, and that for 3 of them she had been paired with Yaiko Taguchi, who had taught her how to speak and act like a Japanese woman so she could fly under the radar. As it was later revealed, Yaiko wasn't the only woman who had been kidnapped by the North Korean government. As of today, 17 Japanese citizens have been officially confirmed by the Japanese government as having been abducted by North Korea from 1977 to 1983. Disturbingly, a lot of them were shamelessly kidnapped in the middle of the day and thrown on a boat to North Korea. You might think that the victims were involved in something shady that put them on the North Korean government's radar, but the investigations actually suggest that most of them were average citizens who just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. One woman was captured while she was walking to a knitting class, and 2 others were kidnapped on a vacation to Europe. Another one, a 13-year-old girl, was taken as she was walking back home from school. Some of these victims were kidnapped for identity theft purposes, while others, like Yaiko, were forcefully brought to North Korea to teach the Japanese language and culture to North Korean spies. After the kidnappings were confirmed beyond the shadow of a doubt, the North Korean government had no choice but to come forward and apologize, but they claimed that only 5 of the 17 kidnapping victims were still alive. Over the next few years, the North Korean government would send what they would claim to be the cremated remains of some of the deceased victims back to Japan. However, as DNA testing would quickly reveal, pretty much all of the remains were fake, leading the Japanese government to believe that many more of the kidnapping victims were still alive. To this day, the North Korean government has stuck to its story, claiming that there are only 13 kidnapping victims and that the ones who are still alive were sent back safely to Japan. Shockingly, while the Japanese government has officially confirmed 17 kidnappings, the list of potential victims suggests that the true number could be as high as 800. Sadly, given the current political situation, it's unlikely we'll ever see the full extent of these abductions, or see the North Korean government held truly accountable for its horrific crimes.
And what did they say? There's no way this could possibly be true. Didn't take it serious at all. Didn't take it serious. And then look at where they are now. Apologizing. Lives are lost. People are missing. Nah, fam. Keep thinking that stuff, y'all.
Just the other day, I found myself wasting hours of time I could have spent working on videos trying to find and cancel active subscriptions. Personal finance service was recently all of this. Hirsch published Heart Attack Gun. Back in the 70s, a journalist named Seymour Hersh published an article in the New York Times in which he accused the CIA of several assassination attempts on both foreign and American politicians who they considered to be anti-war dissidents. Due to these allegations, the US Senate put the CIA under investigation for alleged covert action abuses, which resulted in the release of 14 reports on major abuses committed by the CIA, FBI, and NSA. The majority of the reports included accusations of crimes such as opening and resealing US citizens' private mail for several years and illegally surveilling Black Power activists. Although these claims are obviously pretty serious, they paled in comparison to one particular accusation, or conspiracy theory, which alleged that the CIA had developed a pistol that could fire a poison dart over 300 feet, take a person's life, and leave absolutely no trace as to the cause of death. As it was later revealed, this theory turned out to be true, and the development of the poison dart gun was just one part of the program called MK Naomi, through which the CIA had sought to develop weapons for biological warfare. In 1975, William Colby, the CIA director at the time, had to testify in front of the committee that was investigating the agency. During questioning, he claimed that the CIA had developed a host of biological weapons as part of a plan to eliminate German leaders during World War II, but that their research had continued until well after the war. He also mentioned that the poison dart gun was almost completely silent on account of the battery that was housed inside the handle, and that it had been specifically designed for the target to feel nothing more than a mosquito bite when the dart struck. Interestingly, the agency had used a specific shellfish toxin to make it impossible for anyone to know what the cause of death was, leading forensic pathologists to believe that the victim had suffered an inexplicable heart attack. It wouldn't help pathologists that the dart was designed to melt inside the body so that it only left a small red mark where it entered the victim.
So, what does that make y'all think of? How many cases are out there of people dying and we thinking it's due to mosquito or something happened or something to them? And that's the way they've been, labeled and listed, categorized. That's what's put on their death certificate. They died like this. Autopsy shows this. And it was something totally different. Like, bro, when you start digging deep, and anytime they say CIA, I already know.
Asked if the heart attack gun, as it was nicknamed, was ever used on anyone, the director alleged that it had only been used for experiments and that there were no records of actual use. As part of the investigation, the CIA had to hand over the gun to the committee, and there are some pretty wild pictures of the committee members analyzing the gun as William Colby answers their questions about it. Normally, you'd expect to see something like the heart attack gun in a spy movie, and it's pretty wild to think that if they hadn't put it under investigation, they would have probably gotten away with using it for who knows what purposes. It's also pretty crazy to think that if that's the kind of stuff they were developing back in the 70s, imagine the kind of technology they have their hands on now. Disturbingly, the hearing was the only time the heart attack gun was ever shown publicly, and to this day, it remains unclear what happened to it after the investigation. Rogue waves. Sailors often get a reputation for making up stuff they claim to have seen during their time out at sea, and because there's no one there to refute their claims, they sometimes get away with some pretty tall tales. For centuries, sailors all around the world had talked about seeing monster waves on the open sea that would allegedly reach over 100 feet in height. In 1826, a French captain claimed that he had seen a 108-foot tall wave in the Indian Ocean. Even though he had 3 sailors with him who backed up his claims, when he came back to the mainland, he was publicly ridiculed by the scientific community, as it was widely believed that it was impossible for a wave to be higher than 30 feet tall. For a long while after that, dozens of people continued to claim sightings of these monstrous waves in the middle of the ocean, but with no real evidence other than eyewitness testimonies, the existence of these waves fell into the urban legend or conspiracy theory category. In the 80s and early 90s, the Draupner platform was set up in the North Sea off the coast of Norway to extract natural gas. As part of the protocol that was carried out to see if the platform was stable enough to withstand the rough seas, a wave height recorder was installed on the platform. On New Year's Day in 1995, the sensor recorded an 84-foot tall wave, which served as the first real piece of evidence for the existence of rogue waves. After this incident, a lot of people started wondering how many of the sailors from previous centuries had been telling the truth. What's more disturbing than that is that there were probably hundreds of disappeared sailors from all around the world who had come across a rogue wave, also known as a monster wave or a freak wave. But because most people who encountered 100-foot tall rogue waves generally didn't live to tell the tale, their testimony went down into the depths of the ocean with them. Since the Draupner wave of 1995, there's been a growing interest in rogue waves brewing in the scientific community. A few years ago, a professor at the Australian National University had estimated that at any given moment there are 10 rogue waves active in the world's oceans. As of today, a rogue wave is usually defined as a wave that is twice as large as the largest waves that come up in a particular area. And while the root cause of rogue waves continues to be investigated, it's generally accepted that these monster waves appear when two wave crests join together at the exact right time, resulting in a massive wave that can sink even the largest ships and oil rigs. Interestingly, it's also been discovered that rogue waves can take place in large lakes. In 1975, a freighter named the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior under some pretty mysterious circumstances, with a lot of people in the scientific community coming up with all kinds of hypotheses to explain the incident. It wasn't until several years later that the scientists started theorizing that the vessel could have fallen prey to a set of 3 consecutive killer rogue waves. A phenomenon referred to as the Three Sisters, in which the first wave destabilizes the ship, the second wave hits the ship's deck before it can stabilize again, and the third wave overloads the ship with more water than it can take on. If this were true, it could also provide an explanation for the mysterious sinking of other large ships in oceans around the world over the past few centuries, but this might be a bit more difficult to prove. Poisonous alcohol. In January 1920, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was successfully ratified, triggering a 13-year period known as Prohibition, during which the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol was made illegal. During this period, the government enforced some pretty strict measures to prevent bootlegging of alcohol, which made the alcohol black market flourish like crazy. It was pretty much a playground for the mafia, in which the government would raid one bar and another one would crop up in just a few days' time. While all of this was happening, there were some pretty messed up rumors floating around that the US government was taking extreme measures to make sure people weren't consuming alcohol. These included allegations that the government was intentionally poisoning alcohol to make people who consumed it sick. For a while, this remained something of a conspiracy theory, but things took a turn pretty quickly on New Year's Day 1927 when 41 people died from alcohol poisoning at New York's Bellevue Hospital. Disturbingly, the autopsies revealed that a lot of the victims had been drinking industrial methanol, otherwise known as wood alcohol, which can be fatal even at low doses. It turns out that the government had forced companies to denature industrial alcohol to make it undrinkable since 1906, which was far before Prohibition. But when the crackdown on alcohol started, the government ordered these companies to add quinine, methyl alcohol, and other toxic chemicals to discourage people from drinking it. Their reasoning was that if black market dealers knew their alcohol had been poisoned, they wouldn't dare distribute it knowing how dangerous it would be for their customers to consume. I guess they forgot to factor in that the demand for alcohol at the time was absolutely insane, and that black market dealers didn't care who lived or died from consuming their product. It wasn't until December 1933, 6 years after the Bellevue incident, that the federal government finally toned down their abstinence from alcohol policies. But by then, thousands of Americans had already been poisoned with contaminated alcohol.
And this is with whom we want to place our faith. The same government that would turn around and do something like this, knowing the demand is crazy for alcohol at the time. So when you even implement something like that and put something like that in place, you know there are going to be lives that are lost. And you still do it? Again, and this is with whom we want to place our faith.
Gorillas. Nowadays, there's really nothing too shocking about seeing a gorilla in a zoo or on TV, but there was once a time when gorillas were considered to be in the same category as the chupacabra, the Jersey Devil, Bigfoot, and the Loch Ness Monster. I was able to find that up until a couple of centuries ago, gorillas were considered cryptids, which are animals that are believed by some to exist somewhere in the wild, but whose existence has never been proven. With most of these creatures, alleged sightings often turn out to be hoaxes, but obviously in the case of gorillas, what were once just rumors turned out to be true. Western explorers wouldn't come across a gorilla until around the 1500s, when an English explorer named Andrew Battelle was captured by the Portuguese off the coast of West Africa. While he was held captive on the mainland, Battelle described these disturbing, giant, ape-like creatures that would occasionally prowl around his campfire, but because he had never seen a similar creature before, he described them more as monsters than as animals. Battelle's description sent the rest of the world into what we can only call a gorilla frenzy, with all kinds of rumors being spread about these allegedly bloodthirsty, dangerous creatures living in exotic parts of the world. Over the next couple hundred years, the buzz around gorillas grew as explorers in Africa sent back illustrations of gorillas to Europe, which were often given to royalty and emperors as rare gifts. If you were to ask any European back then what a gorilla was, they would have described it in a similar way to how we describe Bigfoot or the chupacabra nowadays. They were thought of more as mythical monsters than regular animals. It wasn't until over 200 years or so later that an American naturalist named Thomas S. Savage found a gorilla skull in 1847 during an expedition to Africa, which was the first piece of real proof for the existence of these animals. Naturally, this triggered a bunch of new expeditions to the area, and between 1855 and 1859, French explorer Paul Duchaillu confirmed the existence of gorillas and even brought some back dead. Just as Andrew Battelle before him, Paul Duchaillu also described gorillas as these savage, bloodthirsty creatures which stuck in the public mind for a long time. Around 15 years later, some German explorers brought back a baby gorilla from Africa to Liverpool, even putting up some towels on the ship so he could swing around and entertain himself on the long journey back. As you can probably imagine, as soon as the ship arrived back in Liverpool, people started flocking around the hotel where the gorilla was allegedly being kept to catch a glimpse of the once mythical creature. To the public's dismay, Pongo the gorilla wasn't the massive, violent monster they had thought, but rather a cute little 2-year-old gorilla who loved to play with dogs. A few years later in 1902, a German explorer named Robert von Beringe killed 2 mountain gorillas, which were huge in comparison to the baby gorilla that the previous German explorers had brought back. And that was really the first time the public was able to understand what a full-sized adult gorilla looked like. It's pretty crazy to think that at some point these animals that we now see as normal were once seen as legendary monsters. Interestingly, if you really look at the research, there are a ton of other animals that we now take for granted that were once brushed off as hoaxes, including kangaroos, platypuses, giant squids, and Komodo dragons. With so many of these myths turning out to be true, it really makes you wonder how many animals are out there that we have no idea even exist.
All right, so this video here now is the unsolved mystery of Julia Wallace. Now, let's skip past the ad in the beginning and we're getting right to it.
Let's get back into it. The year is 1931. The subject, one William Herbert Wallace, age 52. On the surface, Wallace didn't seem very notable. He was an insurance agent at Prudential and lived what most would consider to be a pretty quiet life. His younger days were a bit more colorful, having odd jobs in places like India and Shanghai, before health issues ultimately forced him to return to England. One might argue that this was a blessing in disguise because in 1911, Wallace met Julia, and just 2 years later, the couple would marry, eventually settling down at 29 Wolverton Street in Liverpool's Anfield district. The Wallaces never had any children, but nonetheless seemed perfectly content. They generally kept to themselves, and despite living at 29 Wolverton for a decade and a half, none of the neighbors ever noticed any sort of tension between the two. In fact, many described them as a seemingly loving couple. Julia, per Wallace, was an excellent pianist and watercolor artist who was also fluent in French and had what he considered to be a very cultured literary taste. Wallace dabbled in science and philosophy and was described as intellectual, albeit a bit fussy and pedantic at times. Still, he did try his hand at the arts, taking up a handful of violin lessons at age 50, presumably so he could attempt to play music with his wife. Together, the couple enjoyed trips to the countryside as well as the occasional night out at the cinema. Of Wallace's many hobbies, however, there was one that stood out from the rest: chess. While his skills as a player are up for debate, there's no denying that the man was enthusiastic. In fact, it was one of the few things that could manage to get Wallace out of the house and away from Julia. As it turns out, however, in a cruel twist of fate, a chess match would mark the beginning of the end for this couple. January 19th, 1931, Monday. The day is now over, and Wallace has just settled in for his match within a local championship competition. Before he could begin, however, he was flagged down by the venue's owner, who'd received a phone call some half an hour before Wallace's arrival. The owner explained that the caller spoke in a strong, gruff voice, and rather than calling back later, preferred for Wallace to meet him at his home the next evening at around 7:30 p.m. Why? The caller claimed to be a potential client looking to set up insurance for his newly 21-year-old daughter. In fact, the caller claimed that it was his daughter's birthday and that's actually why he couldn't call back later. He claimed that his name was R.M. Qualtrough, which I'll be calling Q from this point forward. His address, 25 Menlove Gardens East, Mossley Hill. Wallace dutifully jotted down all these details, but was very quick to admit that none of it sounded familiar to him in the slightest. He asked around and no one else seemed to recognize the man, nor his address either. The reason for this will become apparent shortly. It's unclear whether or not Wallace won his match, but nonetheless, the night seemed to play out as usual, and in no time at all, Wallace was on his way back home. January 20th, 1931, Tuesday. On what appeared to just be another Tuesday, Wallace reportedly worked as he always did, collecting insurance money from clients between the hours of 3:30 and 5:45. According to those who did business with Wallace that afternoon, he seemed quite normal, even cracking jokes and enjoying tea with one of them. Once Wallace was done doing his rounds, he presumably went home. This would have been at about 6 p.m. At this point, it's between 6:30 and 6:45 p.m., which to most might not sound like a big difference, but as we'll soon find out, this minor detail became somewhat of the crux of the entire case. Whichever it was, Julia was still doing fine around this time, going about her day as usual. We know this because this is when a local milk boy stopped by to collect Julia's dues, a business transaction right before the poor woman would meet her untimely end. Meanwhile, bits and pieces of witness chatter would allow us to follow Wallace once more. It's now approximately 7:10 p.m. Wallace is spotted some 20 minutes away from his home, connecting to the next tram line on his journey to find Q and Menlove Gardens East. Since Wallace was unfamiliar with the area, he made sure to badger everyone and everyone he could for directions. Tram operators, policemen, no one was spared. Now, here's where an interesting issue arose. There indeed was a Menlove Avenue, as well as Menlove Gardens West, South, and North, but no Menlove Gardens East. Some who gave Wallace directions told him this, while others assumed that Menlove Gardens East must be somewhere near the other Menloves, as one would guess. Once Wallace was in the Menlove area, he again asked around some more, but as expected, no luck. By 8:20, the search was looking fruitless, and Wallace decided to turn back despite the potential new client. The next update we get comes from Wallace's neighbors at number 31. At around 8:45 p.m., they were getting ready for a night out and about when they suddenly heard knocking coming from outside. Upon checking, they found a perplexed-looking Wallace who quickly asked them if they noticed anything strange going on, also pointing out that he tried both the front and back doors with his keys, but they didn't seem to be working. With his neighbors now standing by to assist, Wallace once again tried to gain entry in his back door, and for some reason this time the key worked. The door popped open, leading to complete darkness. Wallace walked in and started lighting lamps. He went upstairs to check the bedroom and eventually back downstairs once again. That is when he reached his sitting room, and when he found his wife's lifeless body on the floor just in front of the fireplace. Blunt force injuries to her head made it apparent that Julia was well past the point of being helped. The early investigation didn't exactly do much for this case. In fact, all it did was open up more questions instead of answers. All things considered, the Wallace home wasn't all that disturbed, save for a few things slightly out of place. Blood wasn't found anywhere else aside from the body, not in the bathtub, nor the clothing Wallace himself was wearing that day. There was a cabinet that was broken into, along with £4 said to be missing from a cash box inside, but other than that, there didn't seem to be anything that would indicate a robbery had gone wrong here.
So, they didn't rummage or ransack the rest of the place. They just went straight to this specific spot. They did something to her and also hit. So either the person has to know them or know it. He has been inside their home before, something like that. It's got to be somebody they know. Because if somebody's looking for something, they're going to tear the place up looking for it. But they knew right where to go, get her and know right where to go. Yeah, it got to be somebody they know or something like that.
There was also an issue of a missing fireplace poker along with what was described as an iron bar, the latter of which was allegedly found several years later during a renovation of the property. The poker, however, if it was even missing at all, has never been seen since, and to many it was the most probable weapon in this case, especially considering where Julia's body was positioned. Now, the area surrounding the home had been searched, but the poker was just never found. It goes without saying that in cases like this, you naturally look at every lead that you can manage to dig up. In the case of the Wallaces, there were no substantial tales of infidelity or falling out of love, no obvious third party that might want Julia dead. Again, Julia was quite shy and kept to herself and her husband. It seemed almost unbelievable that someone would want to do her harm, and in such a gruesome way at that. If not a burglary, then what was the point of all this? Of course, it's heavily assumed that whoever Q was, he must have been the killer. His summoning Wallace to Menlove Gardens East was simply to get him out of the way, that is, if Q and Wallace aren't the same person. The court of public opinion had decided from the get-go that this was indeed the case, that Wallace was guilty. To them, only one person could have motive to kill Julia, and this automatically made Wallace the culprit. This attitude was reflected by the jury, who, after a 4-day-long trial, took only 1 hour to sentence Wallace to the gallows. This despite lacking a smoking gun. The judge presiding over the case strongly disagreed with the jury, in fact reminding them of their civil duty to find Wallace not guilty unless they could be sure, based on the evidence, that he had in fact killed Julia Wallace. The judge explained that the question in this particular trial was not who killed Julia, but rather, did Wallace kill Julia, and if so, what was the proof? If another had indeed committed the crime, it would be up to the investigation to find that out. That courtroom, however, was tasked on just one specific person, Wallace, as well as the evidence presented by both the defense and prosecution. Now, whether or not Wallace did kill Julia, I can't say, but I will present the most common points both for and against him. One big point would be the matter of motive. Wallace didn't seem to have one. No quarrels or side lovers, not even an expensive life insurance policy on Julia, since she was only insured for a small sum. Wallace would pass away just a couple of years after Julia's death, and in that time there was no wild change of lifestyle or new wife. Now, could Wallace and Julia have not as been happy as they seemed? Absolutely. There's no telling what goes on behind closed doors, especially when it comes to an almost 2-decade-long marriage. But let's say that Wallace did want to kill Julia for some reason. His plan being to stage a call from a fake would-be client, one that everyone at the chess club would hear about. This, along with his Tuesday evening wild goose chase, would be his airtight alibi. The evidence? According to the prosecution, the call from Q was traced to a phone booth a mere 400 yards away from the Wallace household. Had Wallace left his home at about 7:15 that night, he would have reached the phone booth by around 7:18, just in time to make the 7:20 call that the owner of the venue would later answer. After all, this supposed stranger to Wallace somehow knew his schedule well enough to know that he'd be at the chess club. How was that possible? Well, to this...
Now that is a compelling argument right there. It's definitely possible for him to do it, and if that would also tie into me saying, okay, it has to be somebody that knows them, knows to go right there, didn't ramshack the entire place, looking for something, tear the house up, and all of that type of stuff. Did something to her, making it that far into the house on the fireplace. Was the door kicked in, or did she let them in? If she let them in, that means she knew them and felt comfortable. Different things like that. So I can see both a little bit.
Wallace's defense had a few rebuttals. The venue owner claimed himself that it would be a stretch if Wallace had been the one to call. In his opinion, Q sounded nothing like the man. If we do assume that Q was some third-party criminal, then he could have been watching Wallace leave, having seen him pass the phone booth and taking this as the signal to make his move. Now, why didn't he just kill Julia then? No one knows. As for how Q would have known of Wallace's schedule, well, as it turns out, since Wallace was participating in a championship game, his name was actually readily available on the club's roster, which anyone could view. It goes without saying that if Q was someone else, he must have known the Wallaces closely enough to where he didn't want to be recognized, hence leaving a message with the venue owner instead of waiting for Wallace to be present and then calling back, or perhaps leaving a message with Julia, who was obviously home when he made the call to the chess club. Perhaps the most contentious point of this whole case, though, is the matter of whether or not Wallace could have even physically committed the crime, and this comes down to a matter of timing. The milk boy claimed to have seen Julia at 6:30 p.m. The next time we hear from Wallace is at approximately 7:10 p.m. at a location 20 minutes away. This means that at the latest, Wallace would have had to leave his home at 6:50 p.m. in order to make his 7:10 position. With this in mind, Wallace would have had to kill Julia, clean up, not get blood anywhere else in the house, ruffle up the area slightly, all between 6:30 and 6:50, 20 minutes at most. Now, this in and of itself is already a feat. Speed would be one thing, but precision as well. Again, the house was basically spotless as far as blood went, so the idea of someone in that much of a hurry keeping things clean is a stretch. Now, a stretch, yes, but perhaps not impossible. 6:30 p.m. was what the prosecution was banking on, but it wasn't as concrete as they'd hoped. While the milk boy claimed that he picked up Julia's payment at 6:30 p.m., a local paper girl testified that the boy wasn't at Wallace's door at number 29 by the time she left number 27, allegedly around 6:43 p.m. A few neighborhood boys would corroborate this, claiming to have seen the paper girl leaving a few minutes after 6:45. Now, why does this matter? If Julia was actually last seen around 6:45, it makes Wallace's involvement essentially impossible. It would have left him with only about 5 minutes to murder his wife, clean up, etc., etc. If you recall, Wallace was found by his neighbors outside of his home, claiming that his key didn't work on either door. Once his neighbors were fully present, he once again tried the back door, and lo and behold, it suddenly worked just fine. Now that absolutely sounds suspicious, but the issues here lie in the fact that these doors and locks were never closely examined. The front and back doors are often mentioned here, but there was also supposedly a third door connecting directly to the kitchen. Which one was used at any given time is already unclear, but one thing that could explain all of this is that whichever door Wallace had gained entry with had a rusty lock or handle. According to Wallace, the mechanism was faulty and would sometimes get stuck, and if you've ever had a similar issue, you'll know how much of a pain it can be. But what about the state of the home itself? Sure, a small sum of £4 had allegedly been taken, but why not more? If this was indeed a robbery, why not take as much as possible? Well, I think it's pretty safe to say that this was never just a robbery, even if a few small things had been taken. Counterpoint though, if Wallace wanted to stage this as a robbery, then the same question applies. Why not make it look more like a robbery? We could go on, but only one truth is apparent right now. This case simply had nowhere to go. No smoking gun for Wallace, and no obvious leads to who might have done this if not him. In the end, Wallace's sentence was overturned due to insufficient evidence, the first time that this was ever done in English legal history. While Wallace was able to walk free per the courts, the same couldn't exactly be said of his personal life. Wallace was still very much guilty in the court of public opinion and was harassed to the point of having to relocate. In just a few short years, Wallace's health issues would catch up to him, and in 1933, he passed away. Following his death, Wallace's private diary entries were made public. Within them, he lamented over the loss of his wife, seemingly remembering her fondly while also expressing suspicion at a colleague from Prudential who he suspected might have been the actual killer. At one point, he wrote about considering sending a private investigator to tail said person, although he never did overtly mention them by name. Depending on where you read, it'll say that Wallace either died due to rejecting a surgery that could have saved his life, or that said surgery failing is what killed him. Either way, the man definitely wasn't living large after Julia passed. Now, if we do assume that Wallace was innocent, then who in the world would have wanted Julia dead and why? The crime itself was particularly gruesome and appeared as though it would have taken a lot of hatred to commit. Still, whoever did this was calculated enough not to leave behind any substantial evidence, assuming that the police didn't somehow mess up their investigation entirely. Almost 100 years later, and here we are still discussing this, no closer to an answer as those folks in Liverpool all that time ago. There's been a recent spike of long-time unsolved mysteries suddenly getting figured out, and while the truth here seems like it will never see the light of day, we can only hope that it eventually does.